All right, well, thank you. So, topic here is YAML multi-stage pipelines in Azure DevOps. And before I get started too, as it was alluded to, if you got any questions, raise your hand. I'm more than happy to stop. Please don't hesitate. I mean, that's part of the fun with these groups, right? Otherwise, it's kind of like watching a YouTube video. So feel free. I want this to be a little bit interactive. First off, I'll kind of go in a little bit about myself. So I'm a senior DevOps consultant at a consulting group, OST, based out of Grand Rapids, Michigan, but I was in the Omaha area for about 10 years up until 6-7 months ago. There's my contact information, website, blog, email address, and Twitter handle there. Just a couple of the certifications I have that kind of pertain to this space a little bit, but there's definitely more on that. And if you want, I can ask any questions you're looking at for those. So the first thing with this, I kind of want to level set, and to be honest, this is probably going to end up being more technical than I tend to like presentations to be, but I just wasn't sure how to get around that. So what I'm trying to demonstrate here is it's kind of things that I've learned over the past 8-10 months messing around with these YAML pipelines. And what I want people to realize, it's not hard to get started using this stuff, but there's should be some thought in architecting some of the reusability or the scale and some of the challenges that might come with that. And I'll talk through some of that, and the intent's to kind of show what's possible. So I'll go through a couple different stages, or I would say maturity models in these. And you can kind of see where we start from something basic, and then really we'll go somewhere that's a lot more in depth. Don't feel like you're overwhelmed because it's a lot, and it took me a while to learn and adapt to it. But it's something that once you get familiar with it, it's not as intimidating as it might feel. So before I kind of really dive in the topic, I want to bring out just a simple architecture that I'm just deploying really. And I chose the web stack on this one, but you can do this with any technology stack really. But this kind of help a roadmap or a reference point as I'm talking through the different components, what we're actually trying to accomplish. So what we're using is Azure DevOps for source code repository and CICD, and also deployment. And from a web stack perspective, this is a simple web solution of two projects, a web example and a web sample project. And that's going to deploy to a dev environment. And the app source is already created out there. It's not hooked up to Terraform or Bicep or ARM or anything like that. It certainly could, but I tried to keep this a little bit scoped down because it's going to get technical as it is. And then from that too, to show a UAT environment that is geo-redundant. So with that purpose, one of the things I've learned, the reason why I did this is when working out with the new technology, I find that if you do it with two, you end up catching yourself a lot more on the, oh, I hard coded this, or I didn't scale this right. So that's kind of why I chose to do this route. And you can kind of see too where the benefits really start to play out when going down some of this avenue. So now kind of shifting back here really to what goes on in Azure DevOps. So traditionally, if you're using a classic software delivery pipeline within Azure DevOps, you have two different components. You've got the builds and the releases component. So in Azure DevOps, that builds, I believe, has now been replaced by the word pipeline, but there's still releases out there. And the whole concept is you edit code, you push the code to the repository. You may or may not have some sort of CI integration, but the end result is I have something that creates an artifact. And that process is built inside Azure DevOps. Then there's a second component here, that's the release, which does the deployment to the target. And that would be that release tab in Azure DevOps if you're familiar with that. So one of the things that someone might be asked is how do I know if I'm actually using Classic? Because sometimes it's not as straightforward as oh, I'm not using these YAML pipelines, or I am. So what I'll do is I'll go ahead here and pull up an example that I kind of put together for this to help illustrate it. So inside this, if I go ahead and edit this pipeline, if this looks like it, if you have a UI like this, then you're using the classic build and release process. So you can see it's very up. I can go ahead and I'll just, if I want to, I can add a task. I have this long list. I can go ahead and pull that in. Very UI based, which can be definitely a good thing. But I got my list of components here. This here, again, just going back to that process we've got, it's just going to do a .NET Core, restore, build, test, publish, and then publish the artifact. It's nothing fancy. Now, some of the things in here, if you're familiar at all with it, it doesn't, I mean, I'll show in the release, but history is a little bit of an issue sometimes. I think I've got a trigger set up here for CI, But you can go ahead, I have it disabled, but you can configure those type of things. But once that pipeline completes, then you either can go ahead and trigger a release automatically, you can kick it off, but this is kind of what your releases look like. And inside the release here, if I go ahead and edit this, it's gonna look a little bit more, and I go in here, I have these stages, very UI based. So again, here, going back to what I showed in the beginning, I've got a dev environment that's doing a deployment to 2 different app services. And then I've got a geo-redundant application being deployed to 2 different regions, 2 different app services. So, and you can see here, you can do some things with gates, gates and checks, which that's nice to have. So a person can go ahead and release the code if they want. One of the downsides of this, though, is the history on this is pretty poor. Anyone can really go in and make it, so it's not underneath a true like PR type of request or things like that. And some of the other issues too that come in here is the pipeline variable. I can go ahead in here and anyone can just go and save it. And I don't even need to put a comment. I'm just going to save it. So now that variable got updated and there's no history of it. So I think people have seen that before. Some of the other things too that I've had issues with in the past, I'm sure other folks have too in this process. If I want to go in here and let's pick on one of these, and I'm gonna go ahead, this is a release that's already been deployed to an environment. I can go ahead here and I'm just gonna hit edit this release. And if I want to edit my task, I'm just gonna go ahead and disable this task, save it. I don't even have to give a comment. Go here and I'm just gonna redeploy it. And it's now going to only redeploy the one app service. So if you've seen this before, you've probably been burned where, oh, yeah, we have it defined somewhere. And just to prove everyone what I'm looking at here, if I go here and I hit edit the pipeline, yes, I disabled that task, but it's still enabled on the parent, and the vice versa happens too. So I can go into the parent and disable this, but the child one will still have that task enabled. And sometimes where this gets burned is oh, I'm going to go ahead and I update and comment out or disable a task. And then 6 months later, we go ahead and do the release again, but no one updated the parent. Now we've got an issue because something got deployed that shouldn't have. And there really wasn't the proper controls in place over that. Or the other one, and I'll pick on developers a little bit, is and no one really likes doing sometimes static code analysis or anything like that. So we're gonna go ahead and just skip over that task, just disable the static code analysis. That never happens, right? And then, oh, how'd you get your code to production without any type of analysis done? Well, I disabled the task. So that's some of the stuff that you start to see that happens here with the what I'll call the classic release process. And if I go in here too, the other thing I like to call out is, and I only have one release here, but if you have releases of multiple projects and I click into here, and I can define these stages anything I want. There's not anything to tie it like an environment. So I can't pull up and say, show me everything that's deployed to my UAT environment. It's just not built for that. So that's a little bit of a shortcoming for this. And the other thing that, where was I going with this, that you can do, of course, is if you're unfamiliar with this, there's the notion of task groups. So if I go back into this, just to kind of show what I could do is if I could group these and make a task group out of it. And I don't have any in here, but the task group helps, right? If I'm going to be doing the same 3 steps, I can reuse a task group and a task library. But the downside with that is if you've ever tried to update the versioning on that, if I update a new version of my task group, everyone has to update to the latest version, as well as it's something the task groups are really, they don't travel well across orgs. So I go ahead and I can export and import it, but it exports and imports, I believe, as an XML, and it's not a very clean process, I'd say. So that's something to keep in mind with that. So let me jump back over here and kind of talk a little bit about what the good and the bad of some of that stuff is. So one thing that I will say that is it can be good or it could be bad is I can recreate a release and point to the same artifact multiple times. So the reason that can be a good thing is I can just requeue the release using an old artifact. The bad side is that if you think about from a true perspective, you may not want to be doing that because now you have a completely different release tied to that artifact. So there's also trackability there that I could, and I didn't show this, but you can do a work item to commit, to build, to release. I talked about there that a business user can approve and kick off a deployment. That's a very nice feature to have. Implement gates, so I've got approvers or a health check if you like. Now the bad is and this is probably the biggest sticking point, is there's no real true source control to this. It's UI based, can go ahead, comment things in and out. I showed you with the variables there, I can go ahead and just change something, or even worse, inside one of these tasks, right? I can go ahead and change the variable being passed in. So if I go into this, and let's go ahead and say edit the release, or edit the task here, I don't have any here, but if I had any app settings, I can go ahead and change them in here and then redeploy it. So now I got a one-off deployment for app settings that aren't even tracked underneath a repository. And running things in parallel can be a little bit difficult in the classic releases. Not to say it's impossible, but there's some extra steps to it. We mentioned about reusing task templates or task groups rather can make things a little bit easier, but it's not as easy as the lift and shift. I showed how you can easily disable release tasks without any type of audit control. And the environment management, there's not a true transparency on what got deployed where and to what environment. Now, one thing too, and I'll show a little bit more of this, that the YAML pipelines, well, let me define YAML and then I'll get into this. Let me switch that up. So what is YAML and why should I care? A little bit about YAML. It actually stands for yet another markup language. I actually didn't know that until I did research. I'm like, oh, okay. It is similar to XML, but it's less syntax. It's a little bit less defining each and every piece of it. It supports numeric, strings, lists, dictionary data types. Indent delimiting, so space and tabs are crucial. There's lots of jokes out there that people who do DevOps or YAML multi-stage pipelines will spend hours looking for a space or a tab was thrown off. I can tell you that's very true. I've been burned by that more than once. And also, I didn't realize this too, is JSON syntax is the basis of YAML 1.2. So if you're familiar with JSON, YAML won't be too much different. And it's also very flexible. However, how does this tie in and why should I really care if these build-in releases are going to be rewritten as YAML from a UI perspective? Well, at the end of the day, a YAML is a file type. And that file type means that it can integrate with source control management. It also means that it's vendor agnostic. So if you are familiar with certain things that we talked about with JSON, right? If I put a JSON document under source control, then I know I can do branching and merging and do a true comparison of things. I can then do PRs against different types of build or release. So that leads here to the question I say that what if build and deployments were kind of treated more as in configuration files? Well, then I can go ahead or a script file, then I can go ahead and script all this out, and it's kind of more now fits into that software delivery pipeline. So, I'm gonna go ahead here and show redefining pipeline. So I'll go ahead and create a YAML file here with everything in it. It's completely integrated SCM and its code. So, oops, did not know I had that up. So if I go here, and if I go into so first off, let me go here and pull up how to get started with some of this stuff. So if you haven't noticed or paid attention lately, that inside Azure DevOps, in the build and the releases, every single one of these tasks has a button here that says View YAML. So I can go ahead and click this, and there is now the YAML task equivalent for this information. And if I go into releases, it's gonna have the same thing. So if I go into this, go into one of these, it's gonna go ahead and have all the information. So first passes, I just go ahead and copy and paste all this and throw it in one file and I'm good to go, which absolutely can. This goes back to that, it's easy to get started with it. And what that ends up looking like is, here's my YAML file. Right now I have it set to not trigger, so that would be the CICD when to actually run this. I have it set to none just for the demo purposes. What type of agent I want this to run on. I do have some variables here. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. But stages, I've just thrown everything here into the build, all the projects I'm going to build. I just went ahead, copy and pasted all this. So you can go ahead here and say, yep, there's my restore. Everything, if you notice, is hard coded exactly for my web and my sample. So there's my restore, build, test, publish, all on the example one. Then I'm going to do my same steps on my sample one. Then publish that whole entire artifact. I've got a stage here for dev. This is really going to be the difference driver, I'm going to say here, as to what makes multi-stage YAML pipeline deployments really possible, is there's this subtype of job for it called deployment, and also an environment, which I will touch on too. Both of those are really going to be key to understand what the real difference is or how this kind of really plays now into that traditional classic release process. And I will say too, I am not by any means an expert on all the different ones you do here. Normally I just do the run once, but you can do this a lot of different ways. I'm calling it deploy tasks. Now I'm calling my Azure App Service deployment task. And you can see doing this twice, and I'm going to go ahead and put in my package, for example, and sample, the app name, subscription information. All right. Now I got a UAT stage. Go ahead and say, yep, job deployment, strategy, all that. So I've got one massive YAML file. And if I go into this, and I'll go ahead and I'll kick this off, and I hit run this pipeline, you can see here it tells me what branch do I want to run off of, which is a nice thing to have. We're just doing this off of the main branch. If I wanted to, I can go ahead and pass in runtime variables if I want. I can also tell it what stages to run. So if I want, I can skip a stage. A little bit different, that disable one, it's a stage, it's not the individual jobs. And then also I can tell, we'll get into that resources one later. So if I go ahead and run this, and I'll let this run, and it will take a little bit, but we'll come back to it and show you that it does work. But here's one that it did work to kind of show you what it looks like. If I go into this, UI is a little bit different. These are my stages. You can see here I can go up to published, and there's my artifacts. So that's part of that. And if I go into one of these, it'll go ahead and show me all of the tasks that were ran. I can expand dev, go ahead and see all that. That all looks fine. Now, one thing I do want to call out here, because that classic releases gates was something that was really nice. However, I'm going to jump back here real fast. I only have one release, but inside here, to do a gate, I've got to do a gate on every single one of these, all right? So with multi-stage YAML pipelines, one of the things that got introduced was the term of environments. So if I go back to my repository here, when I did the actual deployment, this environment piece is what was called out. So if I go ahead here and I click my environments, that view of everything that went to dev and everything that went to UAT is here. So if I go ahead and click my dev environment, there's all the jobs that deployed to dev, as well as I can go ahead here and do an approval or check. I don't have any set up in dev, so let me go to UAT. I can go ahead and do an approval or check at the environment level. So now I can define it and say everything for production needs to be approved by this group or one of these groups. You can set that up rather than have to make sure it's manually configured on every single stage. So it's more consistency is one of the takeaways on that, is you can consistently do this type of work. So now if I go to my pipeline, this is still running. So we went through dev. I just had it roll it, or ran through build. I had it roll into dev. Let's see where it's at in dev. It's almost done. So what'll happen is once this goes ahead and gets deployed, it's gonna sit here and wait for UAT. Let me give this a minute, or I might have an older one here that's also waiting. Yep, so here's an older one that's waiting. So you can see I go into here, it says I need my approval, I can go ahead and review it. So the other nice thing too is to roll back and redeploy things. I can go ahead and rerun the stage, and it's going to use the artifact associated with that pipeline run. So again, that gets back to, okay, I can easily roll something back by going to a previous pipeline run, as well as if you did approve this and then you run it back, it'll ask for your approval again. So I'll show you that real fast here too. On this one here that already ran, there's no code changes. I mean, this is designed not to, you don't have to be an expert in code. So I'll go ahead and I'll rerun this, and yep, rerun this, and it's then going to ask me for an approval again. So you can go ahead and see that that check is still there. So what were some of those things too that we talked about there when I was kind of going through? There's the formatted slide. There's steps, jobs, and stage. So the steps are really a list of related tasks and other basic building blocks. So when I was doing, and let's just pull them up here. So when we're doing some of this, and let me go to the all-in-one. The bottom one here is the steps are going to be a group of related tasks. And then a job is going to be a group of steps, and a stage would be a group of jobs. So the jobs, I already called out about the deployment job, but the other thing too is that jobs can be ran in parallel, which is nice, and I'll show how to do that as well. And then a stage, collection of jobs, and a stage can be ran in parallel too. And then just because of the way I've got that set up, you can do the approval checks on that stage is how I have it configured. So that first pass, if you notice what was nice about it, I'd say is the deployment job type made things pretty easy. A YAML file is under source control management, so I can set up a branch policy and I can't edit that YAML definition unless I were to, just on OS level tweaks. I'll come back to the questions there. So deployment job types, YAMLs under source control, that's great to have. It seemed like it was a lot of copy and paste and it seemed kind of messy. So I'm just jumping over here to some of the questions. Environments, I don't know the context with the containers there. Yep, that's a good one with the environments. I would say that there's a conception there that an environment equals a stage. I would not agree with that. You can have multiple stages for the same environment. Pipelines for a lot of OS. I am not familiar with Ansible, so I'm not going to be able to really help you too much on that one. Sorry about that. Okay, so I don't know if there's anything else I can really answer there on that one. For those that are in the chat or for the recording, it's just the questions that came across is kind of what are the feelings about environments, and then also how that kind of pertains to deploying containers or VMs, and then also pipelines versus Ansible was the other question that came up. All right, so how would we go about trying to deal with those nuances, kind of that copy and paste and that kind of work? How would we get about doing that? Well, let's go ahead and try to make a second pass, because one of the things that is in these YAML pipelines too is the ability to do templates. And again, going back, if we start thinking that, okay, I've got tasks, I've got task here, and the task then can be templated, and I can take that if I want to a job, and maybe you can start seeing a blueprint on how maybe in a template's the definition of steps. So think of those as templates. I'd like to say is predefined steps that you can call again. May that be on the data side something like a SQL store procedure, execution steps, those kind of things. Not the best example, it's just the one that came up on the fly. So here I've got variables, and I'm just going to go ahead and define my sample and example app rather than just copy and paste that every single time. I'm just going to define it one place, because if I go ahead and decide to change that name, I can change it in one spot. And then here I've got my stage, I've got a build stage, a job, and now I've created a build template that we can go ahead here and show that. The build template is just those 4 tasks all compiled together and just reused. So that goes ahead and that helps with reusability. Now I don't have to copy and paste those 4 steps. Everything's predefined there. So if I go now to my one template, I'm going to go ahead and do that. And the difference, if you really think about some of this, is just the project path. So I'll just do that. And that deploys. So now I've got my stage dev, and I'm going to go ahead and just create a variable that's scoped to this environment. So that's the other thing too with variables, is you can scope them to the root of the file, you can scope them to the stage, and you can scope them to the job. So that's kind of nice to know too about how you insert variables. So inside here, there's our hand raised. You want to go ahead and ask your question if you got one?
I did, yes, sorry.
Yeah, go for it. No, absolutely.
I figured it'd be easier to try and talk through it. So I know you've been talking more so through just the application deployment for your pipelines, but just wanted to get sort of your input and ideas around the infrastructure deployment as part of those applications too. That might be outside the context of this talk, but in your preference, would you like to see a pipeline for just that infrastructure to be deployed prior to the application to being deployed, or would you like to see that as part of your deployment, like having the dev stage and having that first job be the infrastructure to be deployed to dev and then deploying the application to dev after that, or seeing those as different pipelines?
So that's a good question. I know there's some debate within the community on that one. My preferences, I honestly put them both together. I didn't hear just because I didn't want to confuse the audience. And the reason behind that is I view it as in there's no real use on one without the other. I can go ahead and deploy my infrastructure. There's no code there, but I'm going to get the bill for it. And I can't deploy my application. The only caveat to that where I would say where in my mind, where I would I'd be an advocate for it, is if you had two distinct teams own those two different pipelines. Then I'd be like, okay, I can see the argument for that, but then that goes a little bit against some of the DevOps principles, I'd say. So I'm
Right.
going to talk out both sides of my mouth there. And at the end here too, I'll go back. I do have and show. I can show you how to do this on infrastructure too. I've done this with Terraform. I can go ahead and show some of that. And then two, I'm just going up here about catching up here for those on the phone. People calling Ansible, Terraform, PowerShell scripts in their pipelines. There's some of that, but you can also do all that in here. You can do PowerShell if you want in here as a task. So you can go ahead and do whatever you're doing before in here if there was something specific that wasn't that you're not able to quite do, or if there's not a task out there for it, you can go ahead and do a PowerShell task in here. And you can run inline script or you can run a file as well. So going through here now, my template for my web app deployment, I'm going to go ahead here and pass in some parameters. And go ahead here and now do my web app deployment. Again, just that one task, just going to accept the parameters and go. So using this one template, this feels a little bit cleaner. I go ahead through dev. Now, rather than copy and paste everything, and I'll call out here too, my stage is UAT. I've got an environment name, UAT, and it's scoped to that stage. Again, deployment job, going off that variable information. So hopefully one of the things that starts coming across here is if you're using a strong naming convention for your Azure resources and also your files, this makes things a lot easier here. So if I have all that derived off of this name, you can go ahead and see it that just using environment name ties to the deployment, the environment, the variable templates I'm going to pull in there. So that's another thing too, is you can do variables as a template. And what that ends up looking like is here, I just pass in the service connection. So if anyone changes that service connection, it's one place and boom. So if I go ahead here and go through the rest of this is all going to be the same now. So again, that variable name goes and feeds through this. I'm going to take a minute here and go through the questions here. Okay, yep. All right, so that was just someone answered the question that was proposed earlier. So just asking if you can follow up if need be. So now I've got that. So let's jump back here to the PowerPoint and kind of talk about there where we introduced variables at scope. So variables at the stage and also at the job level. Got templates to go task and variable. So I went ahead and showed how we were able to load template of tasks, variable template. A nuance here is there's still some copy and paste, and the template is only in this repository. So I don't know if you caught that. The templates we're using are in one repository. So how would you go ahead and scale that out becomes a question. So if I go to that, how would I address these? So the Azure DevOps YAML can support cross-repository templates. So start thinking that, okay, so if I got that web app deployment task, I can define that in a centralized repository and everyone can reference that task or that job. And there's a way there you can point to what branch to include, and I'll call that out here. And support for objects, the operators if and end and loops. And so that's kind of beneficial stuff there. So what would some of this look like really? So if I were to go ahead and pull this up here and go here, so this is where things are going to really jump light speed ahead on some things, and feel free to type in, ask questions and whatnot. So what I've done here and what I've tried to do sometimes is I'll go ahead and create a parent pipeline. And this is just the pipeline where the trigger would be defined, the image. Here is how you go ahead and reference a separate repository. So in this case, I've stored all my templates in a repository and referenced that. And then here, variables, I'm going ahead and I'm loading that here. That's the app settings one. And then here, I'm going to go ahead and call this stages template, which is actually where everything is really defined. So this here, this stages, I'm defining parameters. I'm going to go ahead and define using the object types here. So there's my project names. I'm calling it a name just for, I think I did that one just for being able to call out the, because my project name is inside the app service name. So I give that the web app name. And then it depends on, so I'm going to say run these in parallel because they're not dependent on one another. I'm just doing an array of project names, which I'm using downstream. Environment objects, so I'm going to say if I'm doing dev, I want it to go to East US. If I'm doing UAT. I want it to go to East US and Central US. My build configuration, I want to publish my projects, and the web solution name. So now what's going to happen here, and I'll go high level and we'll dive into this. I've got a template here to do my builds, and I'm going to go ahead and pass in a list of project names, the build configuration, the published projects, so it's, which is here. I'm going to say that's true, and my solution name. Then down here, and this check here, and I'll talk a little bit about this, is really sometimes with CI and CD. Hold on one second. Yes, you can. So that's a good question. The question is with variables, would it be better to have it as a variable group? And so these do support variable groups. Variable groups would be beneficial when keeping secrets. So you can go ahead and let Azure DevOps contain that. So it's going to be a decision call. My recommendation is if it's something that's not secretive and something that it's a setting that you want the developers to be able to see, is go ahead and load that in as a YAML file or put that in as a variable that way. So that way, that variable itself, that whole entire file will be underneath source control. So inside here, this is the trigger for the deployments to say, okay, if I'm not on my main branch, don't even evaluate this. Again, sometimes with some of the stuff, people will have two separate YAML files, one for CI and one for CD with two different triggers. By doing it this way, you ensure that you're executing the exact same steps for your CI and your CD. So then the next one here is for each environment object. So we're going to go through first and evaluate dev, and we're only doing East US. And then the next one is then for each deployment object, which I've got my web example and my web sample, we're going to go ahead and call this stage. So what's going to happen is for this is going to hit dev. There's only one region in there. I've got two projects in here. So in this template will get called twice for dev, once for each project. Then here I've got my environment object is UAT, and I've got that two regions there. And I'm going to correct my, and then this actually only get called twice too, because I pass in the object to a future stage and then let that iterate through the different regions. So this will load up the environment and call that stage. So if I go to my .NET Core build publish stage, and I'm just going to open these up in a separate tab because it'll be easier to follow that way. This .NET Core stage, it actually calls more templates. So it starts to get a little bit Inception-like. There's a lot of templates inside templates inside templates, to be honest. So you got your stage here. This is the build. Calling the solution path there. Jobs. This job is going to be, this job is then going to go ahead and call the associated tasks and pass in the parameters here. And again here, because I've passed in a list, this is going to go through each project now. So this is going to get called twice. So we have two jobs, for one for my example and one for the sample. And then I'm going to call this template job.NET Core build publish and pass in these parameters. So now if I jump over to jobs and go to my .NET Core publish job, one thing to keep noting here too is I'm putting defaults in some of this stuff. So if you can always override it, but default, it's one less thing for a developer to have to worry about. So now I got my jobs, my build, and because I went really slick here and they're calling .NET Core CLI task, these two tasks they were just passing in different commands. So why not just make that a template and just pass in the command? So there's that. And then this one here, this turns testing on and off because not every project's going to have tests. And then here, this is if we're publishing or not. And then this is the publish task. So I'll go into this .NET Core CLI task, .NET Core CLI task, and here it is here. And I want to take a moment here to step two, where some of this really comes into play is, let's say Microsoft or Azure DevOps decides to update this .NET Core task version to 3. I could update it in one spot, and every single repository and pipeline that's using it would be updated at once. Dangerous though, but again, this is source control, and I can create a separate branch, and I can go ahead and point what resource version to use, and I'll show that. So you can do that, but it's kind of cool in being able to manage that. It could be scary, one point of failure, right? But also I look at it as in it's consistency. So everyone's consistent on the same version of things. So that was the build, and now I'm going to go here to this web app deploy environment stage template. So if I go here, In this one, I did cheat a little bit in Hardcode here, and that's just because the depends on, by default, the stages are going to depend on a previous stage, and you would want that really. But if you overlook that, the jobs here will go through each of those region abbreviations. So in this case, UAT, we're going to CUS and East US. We'll call this twice and go ahead and say, okay, web app deploy YAML, and we're going to pass in slightly different variables. There's a question here. Would it be useful to create a common task templates repository for multiple apps or deployment jobs? Yes, it would. And the reason behind some of that is if you've got standards, I'm going to go back and pick on static code analysis. If we want static code analysis to be part of the .NET Core build, let's say, you put that in there as a task, and then everyone references that. No one can go through and just uncomment it out. It's underneath a separate repository, which could have its own permissions on things. So yeah, if you reuse that way, you can, I look at it from the admin or developer perspective, we can go ahead and ensure that all the applications in this tech stack are being deployed in a similar fashion. So now going through this job, I will then pull up this web app deployment job. And you can see here, this one gets a little bit unruly. You can ignore the comment out sections there, but basically focus on this one. But here's the variables that are being defined. And then there's the web app deployment task. And this is actually something that I went back when I was prepping for this and realized they just recently updated that because I had it at 3. So I went ahead and changed it to 4. Now everything uses that. So now, just to kind of show you that I'm not pulling the wool over anyone's eyes, this type of template, if I go into here and hit run, and here I'll show you the resources, it knows that YAML template and go in here and say what branch to use. So what I mean by that is if you were to go ahead and update anything in that template, you create a branch of it, do whatever changes you want in it, and then I can come in here and test it and say, okay, point to that branch version, and then it will use that branch version of the YAML templates to go ahead and run things. So that's how you can test if a task update's going to break something. So I'll go ahead and hit run, it compiles, and you can see it already expanded out there. I am going to go into here just to kind of show one of the cool things that we did because the jobs with no depends on, and this organization has parallel jobs. So you can hopefully see once this picks up, now we're building the jobs simultaneously. Because think about the dependency there. Those two web projects aren't necessarily dependent from a build perspective. Deployment, depending upon it, yeah, it could be. But from a build perspective, they're not. So now I can go ahead and build against two different projects, or in SPA app, potentially, right, I could build against multiple environments at the same time, which is pretty slick. This is going to take a little bit of time, but one thing I do want to call out here, it doesn't take too long, but I don't want to bore people, is I'm going to go to one that succeeded because people don't necessarily realize this, and it's not really documented that well. Any YAML template, I can go ahead here and hit download the logs. And what this is going to do is this is going to go ahead and show a flattened version of the YAML file. So rather than, this helps when troubleshooting because I'm like, oh, how did the variable get passed or expanded, those type of things. I'm going to go ahead and throw this up here. And this is what that YAML expanded to. So you can see there's the job for the example. There's all the CLI tasks that I talked about. It put in the variable names there. There's the sample one. It expands it so you can actually see the output of this. Because a lot of times people are like, well, debugging these things are a pain in the butt. And they're right. They can be. Going back to that comma, the space and tab delimitation, it can be a problem, as well as losing track of variables and those type of things. But at least being able to see the expanded file gives you a very good feeling as to what all is actually going on in your pipeline. So there's that. And if I check on here, this is probably still running. Now it's moved on to the dev stages. Again, I set that up to run in parallel, so it's gonna go ahead and deploy those in parallel. So that's kind of cool here, and I can see here I've got related published and consumed. So the big difference there is this published the examples, okay? So this published that, it consumed the YAML repository. So it's not actually producing an artifact out of that repository, it's just consuming that or mentioning it. I don't have it here, but you can do a work item when you do a pipeline. So that's there. Also, it does integrate with test and code coverage. I don't have this specific example hooked up, but you can kind of see where it starts to go through everything we talked about. An example here I'll throw out is you can do, the question was earlier about separating your infrastructure and your app code. You can do one pipeline trigger another pipeline, so you can see the association here. That's another way to manage that if you wanted to. So I'm going to hop back here and say, that's great and all, and I kind of did this for this presentation, but how would it look like with CICD? I kind of called out that this is kind of cool to put this in here and reference it that way. And the reason I'd recommend that is it won't even evaluate those deployment stages if it's not the master branch or the main branch. Branching and merging include master, can reference YAML repositories as needed. What this one refers to is if you are doing some sort of development work, and I'm going to go here and go into this template or inside this pipeline. I don't have it in this one. Let me jump to another one here. Let's pick on this Terraform one. This should have it, I think. Here we go. You can go ahead and say on the master here to include it in that one. So if you wanted to temporarily to go ahead and point something to a different version of your source code, you can go ahead and do that. This also supports tags if you want to do tags on those type of things. So there's some additional functionality there. To kind of leave some people too with tips for success, because this is a lot of information. A strong naming convention is very, very important is what I learned. So when doing templates and everything, I do technology verb type. So this is saying this is a .NET Core. It's a publish, so that's the verb, and that's the type task. So this I kind of maybe a little bit PowerShell-ish with noun verb, but something like that. Consider reuse for environment names. Kind of showed that with the variable. Where to begin with templates. Tasks and variables start with the building blocks and go up. If you start thinking that I want to reuse tasks because those are the ones where versions potentially get updated first, start templating those, and then those get used in jobs. Sometimes some folks might be like, so, okay, I'm trying to do X, Y, and Z, and then someone just wants me to do X, Y, Z, and A on a separate project. Well, if you stop to think about that, if those are tasks, you still would make templates for each one of those tasks, but now you have two different job templates. Key vault for secrets is very good too. You can reference that. The only thing I'm going to call out, and that's a question there, is thoughts on using key vault for secrets. Yep. The only thing with that is you're assuming the key vault's already out there. So it's a chicken and the egg conversation. How does that key vault initially get populated? It might be through a deployment with a variable group. So the other thing there too is that would be nice if you're using a key vault, is at least you get an audit trail too, as to when that key was accessed. I talked about leveraging defaults. So I'm sorry, I finished off my previous one with job templates. You would have two different job templates is how that would look. So leveraging defaults, I always try to use the 80% rule. If it's something that 80% of the time it's going to be that case, default it, and then let that outlier go ahead and override the default when they call it. Don't restrict. So what I mean by that is if you remember on my publish one, the default I had was true. Some people may hard code it to true. Well, if you hard code to true, the next time someone says, I don't want to do it, now rather than having to change the parameter they're passing in, they have to change the definition of the task template. So those type of things, keep in mind that, yeah, it seems 80% of the time we can just hard code it in there. You don't want to go ahead and increase your usability. The other thing too I have in here is that special characters can be really nasty. I've been burned a couple times where someone's like, how do I do this? Grab it, paste it, put it into Teams. They copy and put it in DevOps and it doesn't work because Teams put special characters in there. And again, when it's space in a tab eliminated, it doesn't like that. It's going to bomb and it'll give you nasty errors that, hey, this can't compile or it's not valid. So the other thing that I like to do whenever I give a presentation, I did this with the bicep one too, is where does all this lie on Microsoft's roadmap? This is great, but what does this actually mean? What's the vision? So supposedly being released in last quarter's analytics on parallel job consumption. I haven't seen that yet. This quarter editor improvements. This one has been released. I think I have it turned on here. If you go into your preview features, there is a YAML template editor, which is nice. And what that does, let me see if I can get it to work here. it will, let me go ahead and wipe this out. Oh, it's not gonna work for me, of course. Maybe I gotta do it through this UI. But what it's gonna do is it does a light IntelliSense for you. So if I edit it through this UI, maybe. Yeah. So it starts to give you some IntelliSense on how to write some of this. You'll find a lot of times too, if you're using templates on certain things, the editor here doesn't necessarily work the greatest. One of the features I believe is, so this only validates this template. I believe one of the new features they're working on is to validate any, or this file rather, this pipeline, but it'll validate any template being consumed by this. If you think about, maybe you can understand too why that might be hard, because I have to go out to that other repository, insert that in, and make sure I'm passing to is going to validate. But that's one of the features that'd be nice to have. So there's that coming. And the question there is, do I recommend editing your pipelines in DevOps or some other editor? You can edit in VS Code. I've done it a couple times, and normally I do that if I'm worried about special characters and whatnot. To be honest, as bad as it sounds, I end up doing the online editor a lot, just because it seems to be faster to make changes, check, and run. But that's, again, too, when you're doing those type of, if you think about, I just want to be able to queue off a build and go. In Visual Studio Code, if you're doing it locally, then I'm going to have to check it in and then do the queue it off. It's an extra step. I haven't found a great editor for this. I wish there was one out there. It's a great question. One other thing, and maybe I'll open that up and see if anyone has used another editor besides VS Code or the browser to do pipelines. Okay.
Notepad++.
Oh, yeah, there you go. Any text editor will do, right? So on the roadmap too, this is actually on there. It's in the future bucket, but to convert from classic to YAML pipelines. So you can start to see that there is a roadmap there that Microsoft's going to get off of this at some point. They're probably going to give you a tool, and if it's anything like their tools, if I go into the portal and go ahead and hit export in the Azure portal, right, it gives me an ARM template. It gets me there, but it's not pretty. I would imagine it's going to be something like that. The other thing I consider for the future of the roadmap and stuff, if you pay attention to what goes on in the space, there's always the lingering question, is Azure DevOps and GitHub, are they going to combine those kind of components of it? Well, if you do, and I need to play around more with it, but there's GitHub Actions, which is YAML based, and people have written converters to go ahead and take the Azure DevOps YAML templates and convert them to Git Actions. So if you do it that way too, you're less tied into a vendor too if you convert to these YAML files, because again, it's a file type, it's not vendor specific.
And to add to that, John, if you already have an existing classic pipeline for each of the tasks, they have a small button out there showing, it says view YAML. So if you can open up your classic pipeline for each of the tasks, it gives you YAML code that you can, I mean, it's still not the best thing. It would have been great if they have a migrate button that we click and it creates YAML for the full pipeline, but still you can generate it for a single task.
Yeah, and the downside of that is I wish they were to do it to be able to do it at the job level rather than the task, because here you have to go through each individual task and do it. I will say too, to help with that UI feel, if I go in here and I create a new pipeline, and this is just going to take a sec, go through here, I don't really care. Don't really care. They have an assistant here that will go ahead and insert some of this. If I click on job 1, that'd be new to me. Let's go back and try that. So if I go into, someone on the chat said if I go into this, and if I go ahead and click on, oh, I'm on the wrong one. Click on job 1. I go into this, into here. I don't see.
You have to go to edit.
Oh, I have to go to edit. Okay. Oh, and here. Oh, I didn't know that. I learn something new every day.
This is new. I didn't knew that. The last time I checked it, I did only see that for task. But this is great.
That's a good, at least, yeah, rather than copy each individual one. That's nice. So still more can be done. It's steps and tasks. There's no job concept, right? So maybe there is, and I don't know about that. If I add a separate job, I don't know. But okay, cool. Didn't know that one. Any other questions or comments? I know we're running up on time, and I know some folks want to see if they win gift cards. So, oh, there's a
There is
hand
a
raised.
question from Sarath.
Yeah.
There is a question from Sarath. He says, in build release pipelines for PowerShell script task, if we want to invoke another PowerShell script from main, how we can hard code the path of the child script.
Okay.
So,
Build release
Jan,
pipeline.
can I ask you? Can I talk? Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Sorry.
go ahead.
So in the build and release pipelines, while invoking the PowerShell script, we are invoking the child script again from a main script. But to pass if you pass as a parameter, the child script is working. But how to hard code the child script in the original main script?
So what I would recommend for that is there's the ability to publish the pipeline artifact. So that PowerShell script, I would include that as the publish and copy that out as an artifact of the pipeline. And then you can use an internal variable for, I believe it's called pipeline artifact, and reference the one that was attached to that pipeline, if that makes any sense.
Okay. Yeah. When we are passing as a variable, it's working fine.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, just it is because we are like a common one. We try into hard code. It's not working. That's fair. Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Or the other thing too is maybe I misunderstood the question there. If it's an issue with the variable, I would look at doing that after the job runs, download the log files and see what it's expanding to, because it could be an issue of variable scope or variable compilation, because the way the variables are, and it's not great in these because they can do variable at compile time and runtime. So depending upon how it's defined, it's I believe curly braces or square braces is the difference. That can cause you some issues too.
Yeah. Sure.
There was another question on the chat about GitHub versus Azure pipelines. So I just commented that if you are whichever tool you are using for your source code repo, depending on that you can choose. But John, you might like to add something else.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I'm not familiar enough with GitHub Actions to give an educated answer. I do know, and I think someone put it in there, is that in GitHub you can do Azure pipelines from GitHub. I do know that one. So
yeah.
And
I think Joe has his hand raised. Joe, go ahead, unmute yourself.
Yeah, real quick, going back to the viewing the YAML, once people start getting into heavily templated YAML builds, from the pipeline editor, you can see the whole entire YAML file as it pulls up templates and steps and everything into the main file. Also, we have a solution that's pretty heavily templated with steps and tasks and everything, and you can't edit those nicely in the Azure DevOps editor. So it's nice to be able to see the whole entire YAML file as it would be run from DevOps.
So are you doing that in a VS Code extension then?
No. So open up one of your YAML pipelines here.
The file or the pipeline?
The pipeline.
Okay.
And then I believe, edit. And then in the top right, there should be download full YAML. So there's that as well. Once people start getting into this and they want to separate all their tasks and everything. I'm not sure if it pulls it down from like repos and all that, like you were showing.
Let's find out. I think it does. Yeah.
And then you can see the whole thing as it expands.
That's cool. I didn't know that. So you don't have to wait for the job to run, because that's been a problem I've had too. Man, learned lots of new things tonight. So yeah, I'll keep that one in mind.
Thanks for sharing that, Joe. Anyone else, if you have any questions or comments, or if you would like to discuss anything with John, please feel free to unmute yourself.
And I'll go back here if you got any questions or comments. I'll leave my contact up for a minute or two as well.
Hey, John, just to jump back to the topic of infrastructure as code, just because that's where my, I guess, DevOps experience has been mostly for, is deploying out Azure resources through pipelines. Do you see
I'm listening. I forgot I pulled this up for you.
No. That's fine. I was just trying to think of as you see resources getting deployed, um, or preferences or experience, I guess I'm just looking for around deploying like core infrastructure around Azure for applications, having like we'll say like core pipelines for Azure resources, VNets and resource groups and things like that, and then breaking things out based on application, sort of tying in the related resources for your application to that pipeline. Have you had any experience or any recommendations around that?
That's a long answer there for you. But
I know.
yeah, so in a nutshell, and I'll try to keep it brief, my experience is that I tie to first off, it goes back to how to structure your environment. So the resource group, I tie a resource group as related items that are going to be tied to the life cycle of the application. So that means the application and that kind of stuff might go in one resource group, but the data for the application will go in another one because everyone tries to decommission the application and wants to keep the data. So I split it out based upon that, and those would be two different. I mean, could be similar. Those would probably be in the same pipeline, but deployed to two different resource groups. Now, when you're talking about VNets and those kind of things, I know the suggested approach is to be deploying those to a separate subscription so that it's extra secure. That's the recommended approach on that one.
Right.
Again, too, that would be in a separate. I wouldn't be deploying my VNet out with applications. That would be a whole separate repository instead.
Gotcha.
That kind of thing. So the deployment, in a nutshell, going back to it, deployments should be scoped to the minimal impact so that if I'm deploying an application, there's something wrong with the deployment, it's only going to impact that application. Now, of course,
Right.
there's certain things like if I'm doing APIM or an application gateway, there's multiple things around it. You're going to run into that by the inheritance of that application or that technology stack. Same thing with that VNet type of thing, right? So it's just
Right.
consideration on how you are. I tell people that there is Azure architecture, but there's also deployment architecture too.
Yes,
So,
no, I totally agree with you. Right. Like as an example, we're deploying a app service, but there's like core infrastructure that's also being deployed as a pipeline. So there's a VNet that's being deployed with subnets, but the subnet for the app service is being deployed as part of the app service because it's related to that, and it's only useful if that app service is getting deployed. And just trying to understand if that's the right approach or trying to, because there's other, VNets or subnets, I'm sorry, VNet and subnets that are being deployed for just the subscription for other things to be deployed for core infrastructure. Just trying to figure out where those resources should lie and be deployed at that same time is a little tricky. They've got, the cloud adoption framework, but it doesn't necessarily tell you where those resources should be deployed at the same time. And so we've just gone with the premise of if it's part of the application, deploy it with the application, because if the application needs to be decommissioned, then it's going to get decommissioned with the application.
So let me throw a curveball at you that might help you is if that application today, if it was to be moved to a different region, how would that impact your deployment?
Right.
Would it work? Would it not work?
Yep, that's a good example. Yep. I mean, with the new move feature where you can move across resource groups and subscriptions, you could do it. But yes, if we're deploying to multiple regions or multiple data centers, then that's part of the pipeline itself. But that's a good example. That's a good thing to keep in mind.
Yep. Anyone else have any questions or comments? Those are all good.
I guess not. If in case you have anything, you can reach out to John. He is sharing his contact details on his screen now. And on behalf of the user group, John, I would like to thank you once again. Thanks for speaking today.